Nobody coming. Well, welcome everybody to the September book briefing. This is the third of a monthly series, and it's the first time that we've opened it up to all members to attend. And what I'm going to do this evening is I'm going to talk about three books. The first one is Kabbalah and Healing. And then I have Mind to Matter by Dawson Church. And finally, The Christian Gospel for Americans by David Ray Griffin. And what I thought would be the easiest would in fact for me to read the reviews rather than sort of leafing through the book. And then we'll have a bit of time to discuss any points that arise which are of interest to you. And then we'll move on to the next book, aiming to finish in about an hour.
Wow.
So the first one is Kabbalah and Healing by Maggie Whitehouse. Maggie Whitehouse is an independent sacramental minister and teacher of Kabbalah in the Toledano tradition. And she's recently found a second strand of work as a professional stand-up comedian, which I thought was quite incongruous. In this remarkable and profoundly wise book, she leaves her own journey to the final chapter entitled A Life of Miracles, where she describes various critical turning points, including a near fatal encounter with a barracuda, where she was saved by her inner voice. She studied New Testament Greek before encountering the Kabbalah, the structure of which provides the mystical scaffolding of this book. She draws on correspondence between inner attitudes and outer circumstances from her own life to help readers reflect on this topic for themselves. In this respect, we all need to listen to what life is trying to tell us. And Maggie remarks that, quote, every time I have given up control and asked for help, then the situation has been resolved. This represents the dance between active intervention and surrender, though one needs the wisdom to know when each mode is appropriate. The structure of the book is provided by the four pivotal relationships with the divine, ourselves, others, and the earth, based on the fact that all creation is one, so all life is relationship. The author relates how a passage from Psalm 118 synchronistically turned up at a number of critical moments. I shall not die. Instead, I shall live to praise the Lord my God. The initial part of the book explains the four relationships in more detail, where readers come to realize the centrality of their relationship with God and the fact that we are extensions of each other. This fundamental pattern is reflected in money and health, where a connection with the life force is fundamental in terms of flow, balance, and abundance. She writes that we need to receive, appreciate, and then give for the whole system to work healthily. The scaffolding provided by the Kabbalistic tree of life is universal and beautifully explained here in different contexts, for instance, in climbing and descending the tree. The author revealingly applies this to her own experience of illness as a challenge to heal and transform. In the section on the divine, the author explains the various Hebrew terms with their meanings. Elohim as a plural expression of masculine and feminine, Yahweh as a non-gendered verb meaning to be being, and Ruach Elohim as the feminine spirit of God. All this is a long way from our cultural conditioning of a wholly masculine fundamentalist trinity. I agree with her argument that religion's problems are always caused by adherence to law rather than openness to spirit, and that faith is the opposite of certainty, since it is mysterious, receptive, transformative, and always open to the new and to grace. The section on the divine is the longest one, dealing as it does with the various aspects of God and the deeper meaning of the commandments. Here there is much to contemplate, including the danger of making graven images, setting ideas in stone, and taking the divine name in vain by doing evil in the name of God. However, the author gives various methods for healing our relationship with God, such as contemplative prayer, to anchor ourselves in our true self, to creating an altar in your home using affirmations and expressions of gratitude, of which he provides 100 suggestions. Our relationship with ourselves at different levels comes next, distinguishing between the ego and the persona that die and the soul that is both individual and eternal. The process involves loving and transforming the shadow, taking space and time out, and being kind to ourselves. We also need to be aware of self-destructive forces within us and the hazard of covering up pain through distraction and denial. Here again, there are many healing techniques and activities, including meditation, gardening, watching a butterfly hatch. I love that one. Settle us within ourselves. The author also suggests doing something new every day and practicing the Hawaiian forgiveness mantra. I love you, I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you. Having made some progress in sorting out our relationship with ourselves, we can now move on to our relationship with others. Each of the chapters is tellingly illustrated with respect to the Kabbalistic tree. The author comments on the significance of the Exodus, the wilderness, and the 10 plagues, leading into everyday commandments seen in a new light, where bearing false witness can be equated with presenting a mask or marketing glamour. She advises us to remove ourselves from harmful environments and to practice the Buddhist loving kindness metta meditation. May all beings be safe. May all beings be well. May all beings be happy. May they live in peace. Like the forgiveness mantra above, this is a simple but powerful practice that we can all undertake. Our current relationship with the earth could be characterized by covetousness in terms of envy and greed that also require healing. Again, the author provides many constructive suggestions to become more conscious and to earth ourselves, perhaps spending time contemplating flowers or in the company of a favorite tree. We have to tune into the silence if we're to listen to that still small voice and keep ourselves on track on this journey of life. This richly textured book is an instructive companion on the path. All right, sorry, and I better let this other person in. So that's the first book. Any thoughts? And I'll just apologize to Hadna for she's connecting to audio, or he. Once Anna seems to be going upside down, so obviously her phone.
Yeah, I've got some thoughts, David.
Yes.
Because I have been studying Kabbalah for quite a long time. And I think, you know, what you didn't hit on there was more the tree of life structure. I think for me, what's interesting there is a bit, you know, if you follow it down and you get to the base of it, what's very interesting is you look at this, the 10 Sephiroth. I'm confusing people here, but basically the key thing is on one side you have your emotions, which is Netzach, and the other side you have your, if you like, your thoughts and your logical judgments, which is Chod at the base of it. And the key is to get a balance between the both of them. And you bring it down to Melchut, which is the earth, the earthly aspect of it. But the way you get the balance is by bringing them together and trying to live on the central pillar of the tree of life, which is basically where you let your soul and your spirit feed in and provide wisdom and understanding to pull your emotions and your thoughts together. And then you'll live a balanced life, a happy life. And it's one of sharing and caring and love. And there you go. So I've always been fascinated because studying, I did law and now I'm doing neuroscience and psychology. And for me, what's fascinating is the bottom of the tree of life is basically the current cognitive behavioral model of psychology, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is quite interesting because you have thoughts, feelings, and sort of like physiology and all together, and you sort of go, well, that's basically the base of the tree of life, but it's lacking the spiritual input. And I've always, when I look at meta studies and things like that, I'm always fascinated, which is maybe the reason CBT doesn't work for everyone, is effectively, it lacks the spiritual dimension
Mm-hmm.
to pull things together.
Very
There's my thoughts anyway.
Yeah, no, but, and you're right. There are a lot of applications which she talks about in terms of integrating those two sides. And there's too much detail, to be able to spell that out. But it's a very good point, and certainly bringing the energy down from the crown through to the bottom of the tree is absolutely critical. There's a lot of detail, as I say, in the book.
I think Jung might have got his idea about holding the tension between the opposites from the Kabbalah. I certainly studied it.
Yes, and she does mention Jung in a number of places. But what I think's so interesting about the book is the way that she frames it around her own story. And she's had multiple cancers, and she was told that she was completely uncurable at one point, but she actually cured herself from the inside, and so that's why I emphasized in the first paragraph of the review this notion of surrender and asking for help, when things seem almost impossible and you can't see a way forward. I thought that was a point that all of us can probably recognize, in our own experience, but it's difficult to do.
I would, I've been reading on the theme, Lee and David and everybody. I've been reading this because I just found interesting, because I know the author is like a Kabbalistic-ish novel called Raising Sparks. It's just like a bedtime book for me not to read work. Last night I came across this passage, which I found was quite beautiful. Our challenge is to be present to presence in each and every moment. When it expresses your own experience, your faith, it becomes living poetry. I thought it was quite a beautiful little passage.
Would you put the details of the book on the chat, please, Anna?
Yes, yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, someone else wanted to talk?
Well, if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Hello, David. Well, there's one thing about the spiritual part. You see in the Bhagavad Gita, for instance, you have, they start with the material part, then you have to wait up till chapter 8, then comes in the spiritual part. But then in chapter 13, they say, well, the spiritual part resides in the material part. You see, the matter is, the spiritual part is a part of matter. It says, if you say the other thing here is consciousness, where is consciousness? Consciousness is connected with the matter. You cannot separate it. In separating it, you have the two opposites, and you have to be in that middle, and everything is like that. And then you have to find out how these things are connected, and that's quite clearly put together. But the distance in the book is seven chapters and then 6 chapters, and you have to combine that thing to see that.
Very interesting. I was thinking a couple of days ago about the commentary by Ravi Ravindra on the Bhagavad Gita. That's actually his most recent book.
I know. It's my big friend. I'm good friends with Ravi. And we have always, I have a little bit different view of things, and but we love each other, and so it's very nice. And I'm studying his book now, what he is saying, but there are parts that really are very clear, showing that you, without the difference, you have not the opposites, and you have just said before, that you have missing the spiritual part. It's just in the boundary that you get the existence, and you have to be in the boundary. But if you lift out the boundary, you have the whole. So everyone is putting boundaries, separating themselves from the whole.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to do that to express yourself.
Yeah, I can see that. Yes, that seems to me to be part of the journey, that you have to fall into separation, as it were,
Yeah.
and then you remember and try.
Yes, but you have to learn for it and see. You have to see that you cannot separate it. Like the simple example that I gave for long and short, you have no idea of long if you have not the idea of short. You cannot get out any one of them, and it is only by the difference that you notice it. But none of these are before the other, so it is even timeless.
Yes, yes, thank you for that point. Anyone else like to say anything before we move on to the next book?
Yeah, just a note on what was just said and also what Lee said. I agree with what the comment you made about psychology, Lee. And I think I feel like I'm an upside down psychologist, because the way I came to psychologist is that, you know, I could say my dad was like a mystic scientist or a scientific mystic. So I was brought up as a child being translated to the Bhagavad Gita and in the teachings of Krishnamurti, and going to retreats and doing yoga meditation at home and Kabbalistic stuff and name it. You know, and that's what attracted me to go and study psychology, because I thought, how does science explain that? And then I had a crisis moment when I started university, because it was so intellectual. And I was like, where is all that spiritual stuff comes into it? So I totally agree with you, Lee. Well done for saying it.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, well, that's obviously, anyway, it's certainly a book I'd recommend. And you'll see this in the in the next issue, which is just about to go to press. I sent off the book reviews this afternoon. So the next book is Mind to Matter by Dawson Church.
Who's that? Dawson
I'll tell you who he is in a minute. The astonishing science of how your brain creates material reality. And so let me go to the right place. This one. So this is Hay House, published last year. The author is the founder of the National Institute for Integrative Healthcare for the study and implementation of evidence-based psychological and medical techniques, including EFT, about which he's written extensively. His starting point for this informative book is that every creation begins as a thought. The computer on which I'm writing this began as a thought, and this review itself is a series of thoughts. One of the essential messages of the book is that we need to move away from the language of substance to that of fields, vibrations, energy, resonance, coherence, self-organization, flow, entrainment, and alignment. We ourselves are dynamic and self-creating beings through the ways in which we direct our attention and thinking processes. The content of the book weaves together scientific experiments, theory, and personal experiences. The chapter headings give a good indication of the overall argument: how our brains shape the world, how energy builds matter, how our emotions organize our environment, how energy regulates DNA in the cells of our bodies, the power of the coherent mind, entraining self with synchronicity, and thinking from beyond local mind. All this is the exact opposite of the prevailing scientific view that consciousness is epiphenomenal and that free will is an illusion. The process of life and thought is inherently creative, bringing science together with metaphysics. One immediate example is neuroplasticity, where Eric Kandel has shown that the number of connections in a neural bundle can double in 1 hour of repeated stimulation, demonstrating the creative power of focus and concentration. The opposite is also true, that neural pathways will disassemble through neglect. Another example is a journalist who in 8 weeks of mindfulness practice increased the volume of nerve cells in his dentate gyrus, responsible for emotional regulation, by a staggering 22.8%. This means that, quote, the consciousness of your mind is becoming the cells of the matter of your brain. Later in the book, the author shows how these same principles can apply in healing. On a more mundane level, we can create a stress-filled reality through overexposure to news channels. Each chapter also contains practical activities and online resources. The next chapter recounts the history of work with fields, including that of Harold Saxton Burr, Energy is Organizing Matter, who found that cancer was showing up in the field of energy before it appeared in the biological cells. Then there's treatment of cymatics, acupuncture, and EFT, all of which point in the direction that matter is in fact an epiphenomenon of energy and fields. The work of early network member Maxwell Cade and his mind mirror is covered in a chapter on brainwave patterns in relation to emotional and mystical experience, where delta waves seem to have a connection with non-local consciousness and healing. Mirroring and empathy enhance coherence within groups, which is also reflected in synchronized brainwaves, though emotional contagion can be used for negative purposes and mass manipulation. The author sums this up by stating that coherent mind equals coherent matter, and that mind change equals field change equals cell change, which he brings together in his technique of eco-meditation. A further implication is the long-term link between our inner states and the signaling involved in epigenetic expression, switching genes on or off. The author quotes a fascinating study of human intention in a coherent state on placental DNA. The implications of this extend into the experimental method as a whole, beginning with entanglement and the observer effect in quantum physics, moving on to the experimenter effect in parapsychology, where it is clear that beliefs, expectations, and intentions influence the outcome. He writes, "The beliefs held in the minds of scientists shape the material reality they discover at every turn," which the author also correlates with a replication crisis and what one might call an emerging objectivity crisis. If we live in a resonant and entangled universe, then from a personal angle, our best path is to align and entrain ourselves with the universal mind, which is then likely to show up in synchronicities. Here, the author interestingly correlates the work of Jung with the emergent properties and self-organization. We are also entrained to the frequencies of the earth, although in my review of Arthur Furstenberg's book above, I agree with his thesis that this is under threat from wireless technology. Along with many other thinkers whose books I review in these pages, Church sees the brain as a transducer and bridge in relation to local and non-local reality, a view which we're beginning to understand through analysis of psychic and mystical experiences, although this is also ancient shamanic knowledge. In his workshops, the author has observed that people are effortless masters in one of 5 areas of life: work, love and relationships, money, health, and spirituality. If it is true that we all inhabit a thought field that shapes our material reality, then we may have to work more consciously in some of these other areas in order to bring about any change of pattern. In any event, the starting point is tuning your mind to the highest possible state, where we are no longer functioning as isolated, separate, lonely fragments, cut off from the whole by the illusion of separateness. On a planetary level, our collective thoughts are creating our collective reality, and nothing could be more important at this time than the co-creation of a positive world infused with love and coherence, rather than dominated by fear. This thesis is eminently possible on the basis of the argument of this powerful book. So there you go. Let's come back. Unless Claire needs to come in. So that's a different angle and a different view. Any comments on that? Helen, you can unmute yourself if you want to speak. Hang on. I'll unmute you. You should be able to unmute. Yeah.
Sounds most interesting. Could you please give us again the name of the author?
He's called Dawson Church. Dawson as in Dawson and Church as in
Yes.
church.
Yeah, thank you.
He describes a lot of experiments and also personal experiences. So there's a lot more texture in the book than you can convey in a relatively short review.
Yeah, thanks.
David, I thought his comments on synaptic plasticity was pretty interesting because it's well known basically the more you cause neurons to not fire, but the intensity of it can obviously influence and change the like your memory and what you remember, and actually same with the experience and deprivation as well. That's why you can have there's some interesting experiments on cats whereby, you know, if you when they're you know just little kittens, if you play around with their circuitry and then you can effectively have they can have normal eyesight, but because you've messed around with them and deprived certain cells, they'll be blind even though their eyesight is fine, as in visually. It's just you've messed up the network because you've prevented synaptic plasticity from happening. So the connections that needed to happen didn't happen. So normal eyes, you know, but they're effectively blind all their life. So stuff like that is interesting. So I do agree, you know, power of thoughts and can influence how the brain connects and what happens with various people in terms of.
We're also seeing this in contemplative neuroscience. You know, so but I think from our own point of view, it has an important message. Not a creating message, maybe, well, up to some extent, because obviously there's a limit to what you can create in your life. You can't create something impossible, like, you know, becoming an Olympic athlete if you haven't really got the capacity. But it does encourage one to be proactive rather than reactive, and I think that's an important point. Alan, you've got your hand up.
Where is it?
Alan, you had a point.
Where's it gone?
Ah, we can't hear you. You sure you got your microphone on? I mean, you are unmuted, but we can't hear anything. Try again. No sound. Very annoying. You could maybe put your put your point in the chat if we can't get you functioning.
In today's fast-paced work environment, traditional slow methods of creating.
What was that?
What was that?
I don't know.
David, maybe the problem is the same that I had in the past, buying a microphone connected outside the computer, because Zoom didn't accept my microphone either.
Ah,
maybe that is the problem.
I had a few problems, which meant I had to restart the computer completely.
Yeah.
So Alan, sorry about that. But if you want to put something,
but buying,
yeah, you can do so. Anyone else?
Just David, in that little sentence before, it feels to me that connects the two, the Kabbalah business, topic on our challenge is to be present to presence. And I think the mindfulness, all the talk, the meditation, help us to be present, isn't it? It help us to give us and it can go into the neuroscience a bit, but it helps us to be here now and be more proactive and less reactive. But it goes into the Kabbalah point of being presence to presence, being present to presence.
Well, that's always good advice. I think. Regardless of where it comes from.
But he also, when he talks in the novel, but is about this, and then you are connected with the universe. You are, you become like a vessel or a vehicle for, and that's where he said it becomes living poetry. Your faith and your experience becomes living poetry because you were united with.
Well, yes, and I think the whole point about synchronicities is very interesting as well, because it seems what he says. I think other people would say a similar thing, that if you're in the flow, then these kind of experiences can happen, and they're more likely to, if you have a certain inner state. And he writes a bit about that in terms of the alignment, which is why I emphasized all these key words at the beginning, so that if we are moving away from this substance idea, and the next book I'm going to be talking about, relates a little bit to that, in the sense that it's based on or part of it starts from the work of Whitehead. Whitehead was his major book was called Process and Reality. So he was trying to replace the substance ontology, as it were, which is Cartesian, with a process, an event ontology. Which I think, and he wrote this book, it was the Gifford Lectures in 1928, and
wow.
I read it in 1983 when I was in Germany for the summer.
It is so complex to respond this sort of his ideas, that it's difficult for me to respond to it so fast, actually, because of the terminology or conceptualization. Because what is actually substance? Substance doesn't have to be something rigid, sort of static. How do we know the difference between substance, whether it's not really vibrations, processes, and all in the movement? It doesn't have to be something. I can't quickly grasp the difference between the substance and something rigid, going away from substances to as he said, vibrations, etc., etc. What is there might not be essentially a difference.
Well, I think what he was trying to do was to improve on the categories in use, conceptual categories used in philosophy, and so that's what he was trying to do. He's trying to go beyond, particularly also beyond the traditional dualisms of Descartes, where mind is a substance and so is matter, and they cannot interact because they're different sorts of substance. So,
but it's not in modern physics. Doesn't seem to be such differences in Cartesian philosophy.
No, well, and of course Whitehead was very well informed on this, because he understood relativity and quantum physics and tried to take that into account in the development of his work.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other observations?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
I'd just like to say Dawson Church is quite well known for his work on intention and the epigenetic theory, because he has a book, the title I've got here, The Genie in Your Genes, Epigenetic Medicine and the New Biology of Intention. And we work with this in the work that I do, but one of the things about him is that he's interested in the reduction of suffering. And so all his work is quite easy to understand. And I think this book that you're describing sounds really all-encompassing. It sounds like he's touched on lots of different bases, and he's quite a good man. I mean, he has a really interesting perspective on helping people stop their suffering. So I think it sounds like a jolly good read.
It is. It is, and that's what Marilyn said earlier on, that he was somebody who popularized epigenetics.
Mm.
And so that, and I did refer to that in my review. And there's one section where he talks about that. Good. Well, let's move on to the final book. This is going to take a bit longer. And as a kind of preface, this is the book here, The Christian Gospel for Americans. Maybe it should be a Christian Gospel rather than the Christian Gospel. David Ray Griffin was originally a professor of philosophy of religion, and he's well known for his work on process theology and philosophy, and he co-founded the Center for Process Studies. And what's also interesting about him, unlike a lot of modern philosophers, and I do refer to this in my review, is that he engages with the findings of psychical research, and he uses them in this book in an interesting way, as you'll see in a moment. And then in the last 15 years, he's written a series of books on 9/11. And here's the latest one called 9/11 Unmasked. And I've reviewed all of these books because his analysis is of the inconsistencies, and I don't really want to get into, of course it is on 9/11 tomorrow, but I don't want to get into the detail of this right now, but just to say that he has written 10 or 11 books on the topic. And then he's also, from that, he's written other books on American foreign policy. And so here's one of them here, The American Trajectory, Divine or Demonic, ? And I think there's another one. And then his theology, he's written this book here called God Exists, but God, and you'll find out what God means in a minute, does not. And you might think that was enough of coverage from a man like this, but no, here is another book, and equally it's about, what is it, 500 pages, called Unprecedented, Can Civilization Survive the CO2 Crisis? And sort of starting from scratch, it's staggering, his intellectual capacity. And then there's a smaller version of this called Unprecedented Climate Mobilization. Oh yes, here's the other one, Bush and Cheney, How They Ruined the World. And so these are the foreign policy analysis. And interestingly, he shows that he quotes in one of these books, he quotes William James as being very critical of American foreign policy in his day, which I thought was an interesting thing to learn. And then just another thing about Whitehead.
Consciousness. William James. It's an amazing book, isn't it?
I mentioned that Whitehead's Process and Reality that's his masterpiece. Gifford Lectures in the Scottish universities. And then here's another one, which I read a long time ago. Let's see, August 1979, and it's absolutely brilliant. It's called Science and the Modern World. And Whitehead was Bertrand Russell's tutor, and they wrote Principia Mathematica together. And he was also Russell's examiner for the scholarship, and he gave Russell the scholarship in it was an exhibition, I think, in Trinity College, in preference to another candidate whose papers he did not bring to the examination board. So he obviously spotted something about Russell, and he was unusual. One of the relatively few people, Whitehead, who was both a fellow of the Royal Society and a fellow of the British Academy. There aren't very many of them. Karl Popper was another. So let me read this, and then we will come back to some discussions. So I call this Prophetic Democracy, the Christian Gospel for Americans. It's hard to disagree with the statement on the back cover of this book by Thomas J. Ord that this is David Ray Griffin's magnum opus. bringing together as it does his philosophy of religion, systematic theology, and socio-political analysis. Unusually for a philosopher of religion, David also takes an interest in psychical research and is a founder and co-director of the Center for Process Studies, as well as being author of over 40 books. His more recent book that I've reviewed in these pages have been concerned with a critical view of 9/11 and American foreign policy, as well as a further major study on the environment. Here he returns to his roots in the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, whose thinking was decades ahead of its time, with its emphasis on process and experience. Although written specifically for Americans, the book will have a much wider appeal as a formulation that transcends traditional dichotomies of conservative and liberal, while also presenting both universal and local perspectives. In the introduction, David distinguishes between what he calls the primary doctrines of Christian faith and secondary doctrines that have achieved undue prominence, such as the virgin birth and the idea of divine omnipotence. That in turn entails a huge challenge with respect to the problem of evil. Here, his distinction between God and God is very useful, where the latter is omnipotent in the traditional sense and male. It is this concept that is in fact the target of the new atheism. The further preliminary is the status of doctrines as respectively literally true, symbolically true, or simply false, which brings up demythologization and David's transition from supernaturalism to what he calls theistic naturalism. He points out that modern liberals accept naturalism as embodied in scientific materialism, but it's also possible to formulate a constructive postmodernist position, drawing on William James and Whitehead, whereby, quote, there are no supernatural violations of normal rules of nature. Importantly, this does not exclude the findings of psychical research.
Yes.
The book is structured in 5 major parts: God, the Bible and humanity, the prophets, Jesus and other religions, sin and the demonic, salvation and the reign of God. David begins by considering traditional theological method compared to science and philosophy with their criteria of self-consistency and adequacy to the facts. Theology, by contrast, has historically put the emphasis on revealed doctrines and apostolic tradition, an approach that has been progressively undermined by biblical criticism. David argues that the world was created out of chaos rather than nothing, and exhibits anthropic fine-tuning for life. This is a particularly interesting section where he argues persuasively, in my view, that the hypothesis of a cosmic mind makes more sense than resorting to the logically unparsimonious multiverse, especially when one takes into account other factors such as, quote, the existence of truth, religious experience, evolution, the reality and efficacy of moral and mathematical forms. Process theism maintains that our universe was fine-tuned for life, and that divine power is persuasive, luring in Whitehead's terminology, rather than controlling, and this is a crucial distinction. Even the greatest possible power, according to Hartshorne, is one power among others. In a chapter on human consciousness, David analyzes the reasons for the modern denial of soul and spirit, based on the conviction that human perception is limited to sensory perception, reflecting the position of Kant vis-a-vis Swedenborg, although this is not mentioned. Pan-experientialism provides a framework that bypasses the philosophical difficulties associated with materialism and dualism, while asserting the possibility of freedom, soul-brain interaction, and the moral and religious experience, without resort to supernaturalism. David places Jesus firmly within the Hebrew prophetic tradition that champions the kingdom of God over worldly values and dominating power, introducing the anti-imperial gospel of Jesus in the context of the Roman Empire, which he later compares in detail with the American Empire. The earliest gospel text, Q, depicts Jesus as a prophet crucified as a threat by the Roman authorities for proclaiming the reign of divine values, which is the kingdom of God in a new formulation, rather than as a sacrificial lamb dying for the forgiveness of sins. From this, David draws the important conclusion that American Christians today should likewise be anti-imperialistic, a position sure to be anathema to those who still believe in American exceptionalism. Further chapters in this section address religious pluralism, Christology, Trinity, and the nature of the resurrection, which David places, rightly in my view, within modern research on apparitions. He quotes Whitehead's reference to the need for wider truths, quote, within which a reconciliation of a deeper religion and a more subtle science will be found, the central aim of our Galileo Commission. The section on sin and the demonic sums up David's recent work on American foreign policy, for instance, the American trajectory, divine and demonic. He first places these categories within traditional Christian thought, retaining their mythological but more realistic aspects, where the demonic represents a power and a risk inherent in a creative universe. Culturally, this is embedded in the war system and the drive for domination, and therefore imperialism as a response to the anarchical state of civilization. David's case for the American empire as demonic is built on their overthrow of 30 governments during the Cold War and a further 7 since that time, then on the use of false flag attacks and other events justifying engagement in war, including Pearl Harbor, Northwoods, and 9/11. The development and use of nuclear weapons in Japan, and finally, climate destruction by means of the current economic system and its impact on the environment. This leads into the conclusion that the American empire is extremely demonic because, quote, for the sake of power and money, it is in the process of prematurely destroying the Holocene, all forms of life that depend on it, and all that creativity made possible by the development of civilization. Also because its leaders have been too preoccupied with military projects to devote time and money to the evidently boring task of saving humanity and civilization. End of quote. The final 2 parts come back to theological issues and their social expression in terms of the nature of salvation and the relationship between the reign of God and the emergence of global democracy. Here, David treats the position of modern philosophy against life after death, given its commitment to scientific materialism and reading evidence exclusively from that perspective. He advances the idea of the resurrection of the soul, arguing that this can be understood in terms of degrees, and that the capacity for life after death may be an emergent possibility, as also argued by the philosopher Tim Freaky. He puts this in the context of Whitehead's contention that the purpose behind the evolutionary process is, quote, the development of creatures with increasingly greater capacity for intrinsic value. I very much like that. He then looks at evidence for life after death, especially well-documented veridical out-of-body experiences and apparitions, though he could have added cases directly suggestive of survival in terms of veridical messages through mediums. David sees the advent of global democracy as the necessary development and draws here on the work of Reinhold Niebuhr, illustrating this with 2 pertinent quotations. Man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. And then, evil is always the assertion of some self-interest without regard to the whole. The question becomes how to combine power and goodness in terms of a moral order that is fully informed, impartially benevolent, and impartially sympathetic. We need to move towards a universalist logic and beyond both statist and imperialist logic. Needless to say, we are currently a long way from this, and the trend is towards more surveillance and control. I agree that we need to embrace a perspective where global democracy is necessary for the very survival of human civilization. The final part discusses morality in relation to the golden and silver rules, attempting to reconcile thin universal with thick local and particular. David suggests that the golden rule of doing to others what you would like done to yourself should apply to our immediate circle, while the silver rule of not doing to others what you would not want done to yourself should be applied on a larger scale and should also be embodied in the principles of foreign policy. He spells out the social implications of his position of resistance to imperialism in the final chapter, drawing parallels with German Lutherans, who developed a binding doctrinal stance, status confessionis, on socio-political questions during the 1930s. In the light of prior analysis, this is a powerful challenge to the American people to go beyond narrow patriotism, make America great again, and to embrace a more universalist logic. One has to say that there's little sign of this at present, but it may represent the ultimate direction of travel. This magisterial work deserves the widest possible readership for the way it brings together philosophy, theology, science, ecology, and politics in a coherent intellectual synthesis. It is a crowning achievement. So it's a fairly staggering book, as you can understand from from my description, just in the sheer scope that it covers.
Wow.
But it's not. I mean, it's another 500 pages as well. So it's let's see, 99.
What isn't it?
There's a lot to read and a lot of detail in it as well. So there you are. Any observations? Are you all stunned by the?
Yeah.
Yes.
By that one. No, well, I think I mean, there's a couple of you speaking from the US, Suzanne, and he's based in Claremont. He was a professor in Claremont, and he actually said he couldn't. He might even have joined this call, but he said he's working on broadcasts in connection with 9/11 tomorrow. So that would be the 19th anniversary. So I'm relieved that you know, if you start talking about some of these things, then your life can be in danger. So he's still going, which is the important thing. And I do think that this, going beyond the conservative and liberal to what he's advocating is you know, very constructive. Has anyone heard of David Ray Griffin before? Yes. I mean, you should have heard of something if you've read any of my reviews, because I reviewed all of these books in sometime in the last 6 or 7, or no, 10 years probably.
His theories are quite extraordinary and very illuminating and make an awful lot of sense. I was very impressed by your summary, David. Very impressed.
Well, it kind of goes through. That's what my mind manages to do, is to sort of pull these things together. Although I must be looking through that and the others, I noticed a couple of extra dictation errors, because I do everything on. I dictate all my reviews and all my emails, and occasionally it puts in an extra of or if or something. Or maybe it puts maybe as one word instead of 2.
But so interesting how he has projected the pattern of the American empire and projected it into destructive, even to the point of the environment as well, not just the environment.
This is probably a hard one for the average American to swallow.
Yes.
Depends on your political complexion, because the American exceptionalism is the idea that America is exceptional and has a manifest destiny to bring democracy to the world, freedom and democracy. And I once saw a bumper sticker which said, "Be kind to America, or else they'll bring you freedom and democracy." And what a lot of people don't realize is the extent of their covert operations. And so the CIA is, in fact, is an extension of the government, and these operations work on the basis of what's called plausible deniability. Putin does exactly the same thing. In other words, you do something and then you automatically deny it. I
but
mean,
aren't the British also up to that now?
Yeah, all governments are.
Yeah.
And so and it's the difficulty is it's the tension between trust and secrecy. Because if the public knew everything that governments were up to, they would rise up and say, "Not in our name."
Well, I don't know. I'm afraid you have more faith in the public than I'm afraid. I mean, look, we're swallowing so much at the moment.
Well, I think a lot depends. I mean, one of the figures that I got from and then one of the American intelligence person I was listening to fairly recently was that 3% of people, if they feel strongly about something, will take repeated action. 7% will take one piece of action or little action. 90% of people will just go with the flow and won't do anything.
Yep.
So
Germany in the 1930s,
well,
1920s and 30s.
Encouraging thought. If we feel strongly about the need for, some quite radical transformation in our circumstances, is that most people will just go along with the status quo. Well, Bernard Shaw said, reasonable men adapt themselves to the world. Unreasonable men try to adapt the world to themselves. Therefore, all progress depends on unreasonable men. Of course, he was talking about men in those days because of time, so unreasonable people.
Yeah.
So in other words, you can't make progress if you really accept the status quo. I mean, it may well be that you feel the status quo is absolutely fine, and there's nothing to be improved, but...
That's the problem with democracy, of course, isn't it?
Well, yes, and I think this whole vision. I mean, I reviewed some books by Nicholas Hager. It was a summer 2 years ago where he's written a world constitution, and he's an advocate of democratic global government, and the sort of global government that we're sort of steering towards at the moment is not democratic. It's plutocratic and corporate. And I'll be very interested to, I don't know how many of you saw the first film, but I'll be very interested to see the new film of Thrive, which is coming out on the 26th of September.
Right.
And Thrive was watched by 85 million people and translated into multiple languages. So that's something to...
What channel is that on?
Well, it'll be on its own movement. The thrivemovement.com. And I was actually thinking about maybe arranging a watch party for it.
Yeah.
That a group of us might watch it together, and then we could discuss it.
Yeah.
But I haven't done anything about that yet.
Oh, wow.
Oh, just
You better do it then. Sounds good.
Do we need to watch the first one first?
I think it's a good idea, because I think it provides what in my view is a pretty accurate background of the drivers and the influencers
of
the world economic system, the world political system, the way that cascades into transport, agriculture, health, because a lot of these sectors are related.
Yep.
They take you back to the central role of the bankers.
And
so how can you get hold of the first film, David?
No, you just thrivemovement.com, and you can watch it online. I think it's on YouTube as well.
You speak.
Can I tell you something about that first movie? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
My microphone's not working, and I think I'm very fuzzy when it doesn't work. So can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect.
All right. I had a huge involvement in that first film. For what it's worth, I think you'd be interested. It has a lot of crop circle information. You know, I made a movie about crop circles. I have a lot of knowledge about that. And they invited me to a focus group because they wanted to hear my comments about, this is before, you know, when the film was not finished yet. So I did that, actually. I gave them a lot of information that they used to fix the crop circle part of the film. However, when I saw that film, it has people like Deepak Chopra and that caliber of our spiritual leaders being interviewed. And, you know, I wish I remembered better what the whole premises were of that film, but they were, in my mind, horrible. And I thought, what's Deepak Chopra, et cetera, doing in this movie? And so I said to them, did these people know when they were interviewed where the interviews were going? And they said, no. And I said, well, you better tell them that before you release this movie to make sure that they're okay with being in it. And they assured me they would do that, which they never did. Well, that really created quite something where I think there were 9 or 10 of them that put out a statement after that movie that they found the movie deplorable, and they were not okay about being in it. Now, I wish I remembered the premises of deplorable. But when I saw it, I thought, oh my God, it's about the Rothschilds own the world and they want to kill 70% of the population so they can take over. It has that kind of premises in it that are in that dark, ugly, you know, conspiracy, whatever. And I thought, you know, if, what's his name, the heir who made it? Foster Gamble. If Foster Gamble hadn't been so rich so that he could put out a movie without being vetted in any way, because he's got lots of money, he can do whatever he wants, this movie would have gotten qualified and would have had to have proved or whatever. He couldn't have done that movie if it had been a normal movie that had to be accurate, so to speak. So anyway, so much for that. That's, you know, about all I can tell you right now.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. And certainly you're right that people should understand the context in which they're speaking, and that their words should not be put into a context they didn't aware of. So that's a very good caveat. Thank you for making that point.
Well, the point is that the movie is very specious. I mean, it really offended me tremendously, and it's been now.
Yes, well, I don't personally take that view, you know, for other reasons. But this is not the place to go into any further detail. And a lot depends on where you're coming from, what else you've read, and the sort of conclusions you come to as a result of that.
Well, perhaps, you know, that statement that those Deepak Chopras all made as to why that would be interesting to look up, or, you know, to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, if that's available, you know, because that's an important kind of rider. Anyway,
well,
I think
I'll look it up and see if I can send it to you, David.
So I think we'll draw things to a close now. I hope you've enjoyed that, and certainly I think there's enough people came this time round for us to keep it going. And last time I only had one person, and the time before I think 3.
It's so interesting. Thank you.
Well, this is why I opened it up.
Thank you very much, David.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
good.
David,
well, have a good evening or day, depending on where you are. I'm
Part of the globe.
stop recording now.